Okay, it's 4:01, so I think we'll make a start. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the London HR Connection event. Our topic today, bringing values to life, creating more connected organisations. I'm sure we would all recognise the critical importance of getting good alignment between company values and the behaviours of our employees, and strong alignment with the mission, strategy and goals. But bringing it to life is obviously the key to success. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon after this webinar. Your microphones will be muted throughout, and we do encourage you, though, to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll pick those up either during the main session or Q&A at the end. This webinar is scheduled to last for 1 hour. For those of you who haven't met before, my name's Craig McCoy. I'm the chair of London HR Connection, which is a role I've held for the last 9 years now. In my day job, I'm a senior HR director with 35 years experience in the profession, currently the interim HR director at Four Seasons Healthcare. So a few words about London HR Connection. We're a long-established professional networking group, and originally established in the 1980s as part of the CIPD. We have an independent board which is affiliated to CIPD, and we have 9 senior HR professionals on the board. So as you probably know, post-pandemic, if I can use that term, we're now running both webinars and live events. Very pleased to return back to that. And at the end of this session, I'll be able to update you about the remaining events for this year. And just to reinforce, we are a not-for-profit organisation, and our model is based on commercial sponsorship to cover our costs. And you can see on this chart the current annual sponsors for London HR Connection, including, of course, OECAM, who are with us today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So first of all, Gary Ashton is a partner at OECAM, which is a leading consultancy in business psychology and organisational effectiveness. And Gary's joined by Julie Brophy, who is a business psychologist and principal consultant. And I'm also pleased to say we're joined by Sam Valentine. And Sam has got a lot of experience in the employee experience field, and most recently at Collibra, the data intelligence company. So welcoming all 3 panelists, and at this point I'll hand over to Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Great. Thanks very much, Craig. Appreciate it. So just move to the next slide. As we said, we'll be sharing our experiences of how we've helped organisations bring their values to life. And for us, really, that is about creating more connected organisations, because it's how you link them all up together. So if you could move on to the next slide.
Yep.
Come back in a minute, I'm sure, where we can see what the agenda is for the session, which is on slide 3. That's the one. Great, and the next one, there we go. Thank you. So we'll start by having a discussion about what's the role of values in organisations before we then get into the approaches to bringing the values to life. And then we'll have a discussion, and Sam will share some of his challenges and the pros and cons of implementing values into organisations, before concluding with some top tips and success factors. So before we go on to that agenda, a quick look at what OECAM is on the next slide. So really, we develop organisations, we develop the effectiveness of individuals, teams and organisations, and we cover both the hard and soft elements of organisation and talent development. So the hard elements of strategy and organisation design and change management, through to some of the more softer elements of developing leaders. But of course, both of those areas are connected really and linked with the values and culture of an organisation. And that's the thing that underpins it all. So that's a bit about OECAM. Sam, do you want to just give a little potted history of your experience of the 3 organisations that you've worked on.
I do indeed. Thanks, Gary. So, hi everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Sam Valentine. I've done a lot of work over the last few years in employee experience. So my last 3 organisations, so Denise, we can just move on a slide, have been Cambridge Assessment, Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and most recently Calibra. So yeah, across those 3 organisations, I've gone around the values development, bringing to life process 3 times with OECAM. And the reason for involving OECAM, and probably the reason that I'm here today with OECAM, is to talk about the importance of having that external perspective as well. So obviously I've been deeply embedded in the internal perspective and the subjectivity that comes with that inside an organisation, but how we've worked with OECAM to provide that neutral, objective view, to ask questions, to maybe challenge the status quo a little bit, and to bring their perspective and expertise. So I'm here today to sort of talk about the approaches that we've taken, and also to share a few reflections on the practical experience that we've been through. So thank you very much.
Okay, so Denise, if we can move on, we have a question for you. And before that question comes up, somebody asked if we will be sharing the slides later, and the answer is yes, the slides will be available sometime after the session, so you don't need to scribble copious notes. If we move on to the first question.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with moving on the slides. If you just bear with me a moment.
Okay. Well, I'll put out the question. We don't need necessarily to into the question. So the first question we wanted to ask is what are values? And the question we really want to ask is, within your own organisation, what is your experience of how values are being used? So if you put your answers into Q&A, and that might be, really positive things, or it might actually be some things that you see about how the values are used in your organisation were a little bit more negative. So if anyone just wants to put in their Q&A. Right, yeah, so thank you, Ella. That's to underpin the desired cultures and behaviours. Oh, interesting, Sam. So Sam has said that they have values, but they're not embedded. So they sort of sit there and, they're articulated, but maybe people just aren't living them and they're not coming to life. Thanks for that, Sam. Guide our behaviours, not prescriptive, but broad guidelines. Yeah, Amanda, I totally agree with you on that one. And we've discussed that a little bit more. Used as behaviours to be adopted widely by everyone. Yeah, certainly that's one of the things, and that'll be one of the things that Sam talks about in one of the sessions that one of the experiences that he had. To support our wider ESG. Seems to be a bit of paper. Yeah, that's difficult sometimes. That's why when we talk about values, it is about, you can design them, but you need to bring them to life. Right, so yeah, Emily's saying people have a general awareness of the values, but they're not yet living and breathing them. Right, decision making, yep, at every level in the organisation. Yeah, someone's just said that they're about to implement them and they really like the idea that they're about guiding. Yeah, define the expected behaviours of people. Yeah. They're embedded in the performance reviews and setting out goals and recognition system. Yeah, we're going to talk about the role that HR can play in actually embedding the values in the organisation. Yeah. Yeah. It's how we do things around here. It's how it feels to work. Yeah, that's very important. Yeah. So creating a sense of unity across the business. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So there's a wide range across there. I think, we agree with you essentially. It's about socializing the way that we do things around here. It's the way that we work together. It gives us a framework for making decisions, especially in the sort of constantly changing business environment that we have. We can't be prescriptive about what people need to do or how they behave, but what we can do is provide a framework which helps them make decisions about how they behave and how we work together. So if we move on, so really they have 2 roles. Values have 2 roles. They have an internal role. As we said, it is about these guiding principles. etc., and about not being prescriptive. It is about helping them decisions, and it is about helping the organisation set the tone for its own culture. It's about how we want to be seen as an organisation. It's how we want to behave towards each other. So it has quite a broad role internally, but recognising also that values have an external role to play. So if we can move on, please. Hopefully it's working. Yes, okay. So one of the things that actually helps with our values is expressing externally what we're like as an organisation. I mean, if we look at bringing in potential recruits now, what we find is a lot of people now, they want to understand what the purpose of the organisation is going to be like, what it's going to be like to work there. I mean, that really was one of the things, especially coming out of the pandemic, that seems to have increased, is people really want to know, what is the purpose of the organisation? Am I aligned with that? Am I going to fit? And we can see here that the external roles of the values really is around the fit to the organisation and the job, the line manager and the team. So when we're looking at how we develop and how we bring values to life, it's not just necessarily about the people who are working with us now, but it's also bringing them to life for potential recruits, but it's also bringing them to life and living them for our alumni, so that we've got people out there who are talking about the organisation and talking about it very positively around the values. Okay, so if we move on, so those are sort of very positive roles. However, we need to be just careful of the risks of not living your values. I mean, there is research that says there's a correlation between financial performance and people believing in your values. And you can see that would be a link with engagement. So I believe in the values of this organisation. I'm engaged in the organisation. I'm going to give discretionary effort. Then you can see that link to the present the performance. However, the values can also become meaningless. You know, they're just window dressing. Somebody said actually in the Q&A that they're kind of there, but they're not embedded. One of the great examples of that was Enron, which had really good values. So they were integrity, communication, respect, and excellence. And actually, when they were doing research on what happened to Enron, what they found was the only value that they really adhered to was making money. So there's a concern and a kind of warning there that you can actually have a very dominant value, which is A, either not articulated, or B, actually has a negative impact on all of the others. You know, it can be weaponized, and it can actually lead to cynicism. So if you think about the opposite of believing in those values and being engaged in the organization, if you don't believe what's being said, if you don't believe that people, you know, and the leadership and the manager of your organization do believe in the values and are living them, you can see that that would lead to cynicism and resentment and low morale. So, you know, values have a really big role to play, but we just have to be a cautionary tale about how they're used and how they're articulated and how they're lived. So I'm just going to hand on to Gary now to ask you a question about your values.
On mute, Gary.
Yeah, of course. Someone has to. Before I go on to the question that will come up on the next slide, Nicola, I know you've asked, you can't see the responses to the question. That's because we're having to use Q&A rather than chat for this. We will capture all the comments that are made and make sure that that can be part of the deck that comes to you, so you will see everybody else's responses. So on to the next question for you to put into your into the Q&A is, we just want to know really how many values your organization has, and your feeling as to how easy they are to remember. So this is just a quick check before we move on to thinking about the principles that should underpin the values that you have. How many values do you have, and do you believe they're easy to remember? So 5, yes, they're easy. 5, 4, 4, 3, 4, 4 to 3, easy to remember. Someone's put a team, seems to be the one value. 5 values, 3 really easy, 5 easier, so easier for some more than others. 5 but not easy, 5 quite easy. 3, 4, 4, 4, 6. So Tomini, you are the winner so far, or loser. Janet's 5, not that easy to remember. We had 7. So Sam, you've taken over there. We've had 7, but I've advised that this is too many, just consulting with staff to reduce this to 4. Yes, we've had that issue with some of our clients where it was just too many for people to remember, and some of them overlap. 7, but only a few are remembered. So it's interesting, isn't it? 4, but I wouldn't say they're easy to remember. 6, trust. 5, very easy. 3, easy. Yeah, so it seems that the ones that have the fewest definitely easy to remember. Then when you get to 5, they may be easy, maybe not, and then anything over start to get a little bit tricky. What we believe on the next slide are the set of principles that you should really think about when defining your values are the following. And this is really to make sure that they are relevant to your employees. First of all, that they support the strategy. So this is about looking forward and making sure that they are going to reinforce whatever strategic direction the business is going in. So the question to ask yourselves is, do these values enable, support the strategy? The second one is limited in number. And as you can see, we put somewhere between 3 and 6. My preference is around 3 to 4, actually. The problem people have, of course, or the challenge, is to try and get the fewer number, but be all-encompassing. Because what people generally try and do, especially when they get to 6 and 7, is they try and cover off every angle that that they want to, and that might be where things start to fall down when you're trying to cover off all bases. If you try and just focus on the critical few that will make a material difference, then some of the others can be more like hygiene factors. And then, of course, you get on to the easily remembered bits. So they've got to be succinct and sort of roll off the tongue, but meaningful as well. And that means being meaningful across geographies in particular, especially if you're an international business. So, you know, what does it mean? What does empowerment mean in some countries? Can have a different meaning to what they mean in the West versus the East, for example. And then tangible. So having that quick and easy reference point, which is the succinctness, but then with an added flavor, if you like, supported with further description, so they can really get crunchy and concrete with what the actual each of the values means. So we believe these are some of the principles you could have. You may well come up with your own principles, but these are certainly some that would help guide and check to see whether you're getting the right balance of values in your organization. So what we're now going to do is move back to Sam, who's going to just talk about his experiences and what were the drivers behind the need to bring the values to life in the 3 organizations that he has worked in over the last few years. So next slide, please, and over to Sam.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, I've just been looking back at the answers to the first question there as well, and looking at values as creating culture and guiding decision making, or whether they sort of just exist as a piece of paper somewhere. And I think that speaks to a principle that we've taken through all of our values projects, which is how the values come to life and how they're activated and how they're seen is a reflection of what is driving the need to focus on the values. So as you're sort of going into that values design, refresh, reiteration cycle, whatever it is, being really clear about the strategic decisions or the types of decisions you want to make, or the type of culture that's going to be really important. And one thing I think, you know, no matter what the company is, every time we've been through this, the one commonality that we've found is the question, are our values right for now? And are they right for the future as well? So being really clear about where we are now and what the future looks like. So we've approached it from a few different angles. So first of all, it's on the left side there, Cambridge Assessment. So, you know, all 3 of these organisations will take Cambridge Assessment, particularly so really values focused, really values driven as an organisation. So we launched sort of this programme or this project at a time when Cambridge Assessment was really modernising, just moved into new building, sort of setting up a new strategy, and really focused on, sort of future of work and what our ways of working would look like in the future, being a great place to work as well. So kind of focused on those, and as a way to re-energize, re-engage people as well. So by refreshing the values, unpacking the headline values, really focused on engagement and being a more people-centric organization. That sort of evolved. So the middle box there is Cambridge University Press and Assessment. So this was an integration program as two organizations came together. So two very storied organizations with very rich histories and legacies. And the driver there was being really aspirational, painting a vision of the future of what it feels like to work in an integrated organization, but without losing sight of the identity, without losing sight of the legacy and history of both organizations. So not being too disruptive, but also being aspirational and sort of laying out what it would feel like to work as a global integrated organization. And then most recently at Collibra, which is a global tech company going through hypergrowth, really scaling really fast, focusing on the strategy change, the next phase of growth, what it means for an organization to go through those really rapid changes. So focusing more on some of the internal drivers around productivity, performance, how culture translates to customer satisfaction. So three slightly different focuses there. I think in each of them probably threw up different challenges or different needs. So Cambridge Assessment, for example, really heavily focused on inclusivity and what it means to work there and what it means to have a sense of belonging at that organization. As I say, Cambridge University Press and Assessment, a lot around identity and sort of coming together and how you preserve the best of two organizations. Collibra much more around the customer focus, the strategic needs to keep growing and scaling. So we'll sort of unpack what that meant in terms of some of the challenges and some of the approaches we took to this a little bit later, but just wanted to lay out this context. And then, Denise, if we can just move on to the next slide. Another question to put to everyone here for the Q&A. What do you need to bring your values to life? So what are the drivers? Or sorry, why do you need to bring your values to life? What's driving you to be on this webinar and to be thinking about values, or to be thinking about values in general? So we'll just give a couple of minutes to answer that. So a few comments coming in there. So they're authentic and not just a tick of the jobs to do list. Yes, I think that authenticity is incredibly important as well. And that's something that we really found as well. They have to work for the organization now, as well as for the organization in the future, and really reflect what the organization is. So we've talked in the past, I think, with as we've been through these projects, about the principle of edginess, and so values being on the edge of where we are now and the edge of aspiration as well. And that's where I think the authenticity really comes from. Recognition, yes, Akaya, really important to recognize and celebrate performance and behaviors, and focus on the behaviors that are creating the culture that we want to see at organizations. So culture, values are a huge statement of culture, and obviously have a huge defining function of what the culture should look like and what culture we're capturing and celebrating. Fairness and equality, commitment, sharedness, motivation, how we translate words into actions and behaviors as well. So designing new workplaces, aligning programs to values. So I'm seeing a lot here about culture, and to make sure people are focused in the same direction. And I think these are the sorts of drivers that we've seen quite a lot and are really important to people. Strategic focus as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but making sure that the values and the strategy and the communications around the values and strategy are all totally aligned as well, that they feel coherent and all feel like they're pointing in the same direction. And then the bringing to life bit is comes later, how you start to see that through performance management or through recognition or through some of the big decision making processes as well. Definitely for recruitment, I think Gary mentioned it earlier, Julie mentioned it probably, the employer branding, what it actually says about an organisation. And you see it on Glassdoor and you see it all over the place, and people go and have a look at the culture of the organisation and how people describe the culture of an organisation before making up their mind whether to join or not. So that has a huge sort of lever there as well. It's quite a lot there. I think hand over to Julie now.
Yep. If we just move on, Denise, please. Yeah, thanks. So from our experience, although the detail of each of the actual projects we do with clients varies, and obviously when we work with Sam, we've worked with Sam 3 times now, so obviously each project was slightly different, but really this is sort of for us the approach to take for really successfully implementing and bringing to life those values. I mean, the first one is sort of setting up. I'm not going to go through each of these, but just a couple of key points out of some of them. And for us, one of the really key points is the senior sponsorship. Is they really need to be on board with what you're doing with the values. They really need to understand the consequences of what changing those values is going to be in the way people are going to behave and the way that they're going to interact and the ways of working in the organization. So having that sponsorship right at the beginning and making it really tangible. So getting them out, getting them talking about the changes, getting them be behind the design and talking the language and really listening is absolutely key. And also in the next one, when we talk about design and refinement, is getting as much input as you possibly can from a really wide audience, because these are the values. The more they understand them, the more they're going to be able to bring them to life, the more they're going to see how it's going to direct the decision making they do and the way that they behave. And one of the things that Gary was talking about earlier, and certainly with Sam, because we've worked with Sam on a couple of multicultural ones, is really understanding how the values are going to be different across different parts of your business. So, really getting out and listening and using language which really is resonates and is right for them. So that's kind of really getting people engaged in it. And then one of the key things about actually getting them embedded and bringing them to life is this socializing. So really getting out there and telling people what it means and talking to them. Sometimes we've actually said here are behavioral indicators. With some organizations we don't, but it's actually really about socializing those values and communicating regularly. I think, so Dave Franks asked, can you actually roll out and embed over time? I think you roll out in one go, but embedding does take time. So it's not a one-off event. You don't just communicate your values, you communicate them again and again and again, and reinforcing what they're doing and how they're helping with the strategy. And also, if you look at things like embedding, one of the things we talk about as well is actually going on and reviewing those values and the behaviours, because as the world changes and our strategy might change, the values will probably be the same, but some of the behaviours might or might not be appropriate. And also one of the things that's really important is removing those organisational blockers. What is it that's going to stop me from actually behaving in the way that my values want me to? So things like, are they actually in our, not only are they in our recruitment process, but are they in our appraisal system? And David also asked to say, is it fair to suggest that implementing badly is worse than having none at all? I think I would actually probably agree with you on that one, because if you implement a set of values badly, the next time you try to want to do that implementation or you want to change the values, you've already got a change history that says we implement badly. I think the other way is if you implement badly designed or you implement badly the values, that's when they can start to be weaponized or start to be misused as they were at things like Enron. So I would say, yes, it's probably better to actually sort of step back, take more time, and not actually communicate a set of values that are not going to be delivering your strategy or actually going to make it worse for the way that people work together. Okay. So I'm going to hand back to Sam again to talk about his experience.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, I just want to talk about again the three projects that we've done and some of the broad approaches we've taken here. And I think these approaches really speak to what's driving the project. They also speak a little bit to internal cultures of organisations as well, and the way that cultural change happens in organisations. And I'm looking at a comment here in the Q&A as well. Can't get leadership team to role model the values. And I think that's so incredibly important as well. Like values, and to David's point just now, implemented badly, probably worse than not having values at all. And leadership role modeling, we'll talk about this in the lessons learned, but is incredibly important to values landing and being seen as credible and being seen as authentic as well. So I think all the way through the values design process, there is a question of whether organizations tend to be leadership-led or people-first organizations or hierarchical organizations. And that sort of might give some clues as to where that feeling of ownership of values lie. So if leadership teams aren't willing to role model the values, there might be sort of that might suggest a more top-down approach where leaders are sort of making the values decisions and reflecting their sort of preferences as well. So that might sort of be a question to help leaders along there. But three, again, very sort of broadly how we've approached this. So going back to the first time around, Cambridge Assessment, this was a project in taking our headline values and really unpacking what they mean for people and what they should mean for people across the organisation. So we took a very strongly bottom-up approach with that. We had the headline values. We then wanted to really understand from people what they meant and how they were experienced and how that should then impact the sort of statements underneath and the behavioural framework. So that was a high degree, a very, very high degree of involvement from our employee communities, particularly our community groups, our local leads, so sort of looking globally from countries around the world as well, which filtered back up to the sponsor, to the leadership teams. So we were really playing back what employees were saying, what people were saying, as a way for leadership teams to really understand how values were landing across the organizations as well. So that was one approach. Again, a lot of involvement, a lot of consultation, a lot of discussion, a lot of fact finding, a lot of data collection, filtering up to some of that more leadership-led decision making. As we moved across to the integration program, at a time of very heavy change, at a time probably of a bit of anxiety, as mergers sort of tend to be, we took much more of a middle out approach. So we knew pretty much the outcomes we were working towards. We knew the drivers, which was integration and consolidation of the values. We knew we wanted to keep the best of both, but we didn't want to overload people with lots of conversation and lots of sort of focus. So we really relied on our leadership teams and our change leads. And when I'm sort of talking about leaders here, leaders at all levels, so leaders of communities, leaders of functions, leaders of countries, to sort of work through them to represent the needs of the people that they lead. So working really, really closely with manager groups to filter upwards, to filter outwards, and to make those suggestions and recommendations, which we will present to leadership teams and to the organisation as a whole as well. So less consultative, more involvement probably from middle management layers. And then third, most recent project, again, different context, different drivers, but this was much more of a top-down approach. So this was a founder-led organisation, going through hypergrowth, a lot of change at the top, big strategic changes happening, massive growth, massive capitalisation on market opportunities. There was probably more of a need to be a bit more directive of what are the priorities. And this is where we did a lot of engagement work with the leadership teams, senior leadership, exec board, to really understand from them what their horizon scanning looks like, what their priorities are, how that works then across the other functions of the organisation. And then over to the employee research and employee listening was nuancing and understanding and really delving into that to see how that resonated, to make sure that that would land. So the elements sort of within that, still a lot of engagement at all levels, but where kind of the decision making was coming from just a slightly different layer in each of those projects. So each of those, again, really relied on having a sponsor in place and making sure that there were those checkpoints as we were going along as well. The three very broad sort of approaches there, and I'll hand to Gary to talk a little bit about pros and cons.
Thank you, Sam. So, which kind of reflects that. So the first build on the slide will be the bottom up. If we can just press the button one more time, then we'll get the bottom up approach. So as Sam was saying, high level of employee involvement, the language will resonate well because you really get the nuances of what people mean, and it'll work across functions or across geographies. And you get the ownership because they will relate to the wording and the sentiment that you're trying to come across. Of course, the downsides of it are it does take longer because you're trying to involve a good cross section. So when you're doing sampling of your organization across geographies, functions, hierarchy, gender, then it can sort of explode it out. So you have to really weigh the cost of that versus the benefits that are on the left-hand side. And of course, therefore, there's a lot of extra communication needed. And then there's the risk, and this is really how you manage the focus groups that you do, that individuals may expect that what they've said will be directly written into the values. So as long as they're aware that it's done in a way that we're collecting a range of views and then we'll synthesize, they just need their expectations managed. So the build on the slide next will be, I presume, the top down, but we'll see. There we go. So as Sam was saying, with the leadership team closest to the strategy, so it'll probably be more future oriented and will be driven by the necessity of what the strategy is requiring. Can be quicker, of course, because you've got fewer people engaged in it, but then you have the downsides, of course, because it feels more imposed, feels less involved, and therefore the language may not resonate because you're creating a gap maybe as to where the leadership team wants it to be and where the actual employees are with the meaning behind the values. So that would need managing then as a consequence if you do the top-down approach. And then surprise, surprise, the one in the middle is kind of the best of both, or it aims and aspires to be the best of both, where you do get that senior leadership ownership, but you are involving the employees as well. And it's just getting that balance right to help you through in order to come up with a successful set of values with descriptions that people resonate to, but you get them out there in good time. So moving back to Sam, Sam will relate his experiences of what worked well and what could be improved when the three projects that he's run on this.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, if we could just move on a slide. There's a couple of questions here as well, which I hope get answered along the way. So which approach do you recommend for embedding existing values, and what format did you use to gather feedback data? So hopefully I'll answer them as we go along, but if not, please ask me again. So I think, yeah, what worked well from my perspective, certainly in the first approach, was really involving a lot of people in the values creation process and involving as many perspectives as possible, and as many different views and feelings on the values. Yeah, that was great right from the start, and that really helped kind of focus down from really expansive everything on the table to really defining the parameters and focusing down on what works. And that takes a lot of listening skill. I think a lot of, there's a really heavy employee listening focus to that, which is something, again, that I would say is an essential part of bringing values to life, is how we listen to people. So with OECAM, we've run really detailed focus groups. We've done a lot of interviews. I think we've interviewed every leader at every company. We've sort of had interviews with different stakeholders, a lot of data collection and data analysis. And again, having that objective view on the data analysis is really important as well. So that whole sort of listening approach has been incredibly valuable. And it also helps give people that sense of ownership over the values as well, and really helps kind of put it in people's hands and builds from the ground up. That also means that there are very few surprises when values are launched. People sort of automatically see or feel that familiarity with values as well. So yeah, I'd say that's fairly essential. So I'd say in order to answer the question there about how we've listened, yeah, surveys, definitely, employee surveys, yeah, as part of engagement surveys, but also bespoke value surveys as well, focus groups, one-to-ones. I'd say in each organisation, 1 billion conversations with people as well, presentations, conversations. You know, one thing I've discovered, every single person you speak to has a very strong opinion on value statements, whether that's positive or negative, and all those opinions are really, really valid and really, really important. So as moving across, I think the iterative approach as well, and so talk about that with some of the lessons learned along the way, how you iterate and what the stages are. So making sure that there are really clear design cycles. So you're agreeing the headline values, and then the strap lines, and then the behaviours, or you're agreeing the icons before you go into the descriptors. It doesn't necessarily matter what order, but making sure that's really carefully staged through as well. Being really clear as well about the data and evidence that's being brought into this, so whether that's internal data, external data, that the evidence is well sourced, it's representative, it's not just based on the feedback from one conversation, it's themes and trends across the conversations and focus groups. That's worked really, really well as well, and that's really helped engage leadership teams and engage people who can be a bit more skeptical about values sometimes. There is always an emotional appeal, but having the logical appeal to values definitely helps as well with landing that. And I think representation as well, so working with people in Collibra and Cambridge University Press as well, how you set up the focus groups. Yeah, I think in Collibra, it took us longer to set up the focus groups to try and get the representation across function and geography and gender, everything exactly right, to make sure that we were getting that representation. But once you get it, I think the data that comes back is credible, reliable, and really, really rich as well. Something, again, from a more top-down perspective, the clarity and the mandate on what you can change and what you can't change, what's up for grabs and what's not up for grabs, again, really, really important. That's a sponsorship role, that's an organizational sort of culture function, but having that clarity definitely really, really helps. And being really upfront about understanding stakeholder preferences, who the stakeholders are, who some of the blockers might be, and who some of the advocates might be, who your critical friends are going to be. Yeah, they're all really important. You need the resistors, you need the critical friends, you need the advocates to again, provide that roundness of view. So having all that in place has really worked well. Some of the challenges and some of the things perhaps I wish I'd had done a little bit differently. So if we can just move on to the next slide. So just a few things possibly to improve. Again, if you're taking a bottom-up approach, it's very hard to please all the people all the time. It's basically impossible to please all the people all the time. There is the risk that with the bottom-up approach, it looks like consensus building. And I think the really clear communications that this is information finding, listening, it's not consensus building, and actually being really clear to people as well that just because people suggest something, it might not make it into the final cut. And I think having that clarity as well, really, really helps sort of, again, just define the parameters. Also, it can be really easy and really tempting and honestly really fun to get trapped into wordsmithing and moving the commas around and focusing on the apostrophes. And the risk of that is it takes away from the content and the direction, the strategic alignment. So I know I've sort of definitely been trapped in those cycles of wordsmithing and spelling and things like that at the expense of content. So just making sure that that's really clear as well. I think making sure as well that there is shared understanding of what values are actually for. We asked the question earlier, there's different approaches. I would always see values as being a license for people to behave in a certain way. or a tool for reflection rather than a prescriptive list of must-do statements. And again, having that approach, I think, just really helps set up the conversations and the data collection that goes along with this as well. I mentioned it earlier, but just to reinforce again, the sequencing. And again, you know, in some of these projects, I know probably I've been guilty of going too far, too fast, and then being pulled back. So making sure that there are stage gates to the development process, that you're checking back in on an agreed cycle, just to make, you know, again, just make sure that things are going through at the right pace, the right time. Yeah, and that all comes down to, you know, communication, engagement, role modeling as well. And so the way that culture change projects are managed is the culture change that will, you know, result at the end of it as well. So high engagement, high role modeling, really important. And finally, I think, you know, this is a feature probably of all organizations. Yeah, it's not to put too fine a point on it, the politics, and making sure that, that politics and sensitivities are navigated. Again, something that is a really key role of a sponsor, really important from a stakeholder management point of view, is really about understanding what some of the sensitivities are, what people are hoping to see, what they want to see, what they don't want to see as well, and sort of avoiding some of those pitfalls and traps before you get into them. And so managing those relationships and understanding the best ways to manage those relationships as well. In some organizations, it might be that values go to a chief people officer before they go to CEO. In other organizations, it might be the other way around, or it might need to go to an exec team before it goes to a community group, or the other way around. And I think that organizational understanding is really, really important to sort of just moving things through. And then just finally there as well, you know, talked a bit about employer branding, EVP. So it's just making sure that you're not losing sight of the external context as well and the external focus. Again, values are very sort of, you know, the values design process especially can be very, very internal, but it's just making sure there is an eye on what's happening externally, what competitors are saying, what other, you know, how it sort of looks against other similar organizations as well. So just keeping that eye out. Just a few things there. Laura and anonymous attendee, hopefully I answered your question there. If not, happy to answer later as well.
So if we just move on, Denise. So obviously we're talking to a lot of HR people, and this is London HR Connect. So we wanted to look at what is the role of HR in this. And really, I think it's two things. One is to act as experts and supporters as we go through, and helping the leaders to role model and providing that employee perspective when we're talking, but keeping the ownership with the C-suite. Right at the beginning, I said one of the really important things, and Sam's reinforced that, is it's got to stay with the C-suite. It's not for HR to take ownership of this. It is not an HR activity. It has to be owned by the C-suite. And then really, as you go through those sort of first two stages of setting up the project and, you know, designing and refining the values, you are sort of that expert, that supporter, you can, you know, and providing support. And then as it moves into sort of the stages of socializing and embedding, that's really where HR kind of picks up a bit more of a role, becomes more of a driver. Again, not owning it, but actually being seen more as being able to drive out those values and things, because there's lots of stuff within the HR remit around the processes that you have, like recruitment, like appraisal, you know, any of those kind of things, which really can reinforce those values, because they should all be aligned. You should be able to cut through your recruitment, you should be able to cut through the way that you appraise and reward people and see those values reflected in that. So it's really, it's sort of a two-headed role, you know, experts and drivers, and it changes as you go through the project. So that's what we see, and that's how we've worked most effectively with HR groups when we've been doing this. So I'm now going to just hand it over to Gary just to summarize some stuff that we've been through.
Thank you. So these are the top tips that sort of come from the previous set of slides. So I won't read them all out. You will get the handouts later. Just pick out a couple of them. We've talked again and again about sponsorship being at the highest level. There was one person under the name of Anonymous who said that they can't get the leadership team to role model the values. And of course, that's a bad start when it starts at that level. I mean, depending on what kind of organization it is, the board now really needs to take above the leadership team, have a responsibility to ensuring that the values are being rolled out and enacted. And so really the board may have a role in making sure that the leadership fulfill the values and live the values. Coming up with that clear design set of principles, important, especially on the one example, as we asked earlier, is the number of values. And I think it was Nikki who mentioned that maybe when there are a high number of values, it's because they've moved on from beliefs and they've moved more into behaviors, because then you end up sort of coming up with a huge shopping list. So that was a good insight, Nikki. But basically have a clear set of principles, and then that allows you to corral people in the right way. And then I'll move to on the spread responsibility, because it's not just for HR, but it's across the country, and sorry, across the company. And as David said, it'll take time to embed over time. And I think it was Mohammed very early on said that, for example, for them, 40% of their year-end evaluation is based around the values. So there are ways and means, as you all know, to keep on reinforcing the values. And the last point there of obviously bringing in any external independent provider, doesn't obviously have to be ours, but in order to have that neutral insight and just helps or prevents you seeing your own worldview. If you're inside an organization, it's sometimes very hard to pull yourselves out and see yourselves from the outside in. So there are top tips. Craig, I think it's over to you to just prompt for a few questions.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much to all three of you. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that. I have a few questions just to start the ball rolling. First question is, I think often the litmus test of a values program is whether or not behavior that's not congruent has consequences. And you know, often it's easy to reward the good expression of the values, but harder often to introduce consequences for non-congruent behavior. Have you seen that work effectively in any organizations that you've worked with? Yes,
I've seen one, it was a number of years ago, where it was someone in sales who was a high sales performer, but kind of people knew that the way in which the selling was going on was a little bit on the edge, but it was kind of accepted behavior and then that person was the hero. There came a time when the leadership decided to really reassert what its values are going to be about. And they actually removed that individual who was a high profile person. So it sent some shockwaves through the business to say, from now on, you aren't going to just rise through the ranks just because of hitting the numbers. You're going to have to hit the values as well.
Yeah. I think just building on that, and also Mohammed's point about 40% of the performance is around values, is it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So building that into the way that you appraise and reward and promote is a really key thing about making sure that the behaviours that aren't congruent with the values are also not rewarded.
Can I just jump in there as well? I think one thing I've seen, I mentioned it earlier about values being a tool for reflection in a lot of kind of value statements that we've written as being inhibits, or the kind of negative indicators as well. And I think one of the principles that we take is that we all probably at some point display some of the behaviours that aren't quite in line with the values. And I think those organisations that have more of a growth mindset and take more of a coaching approach can use the values frameworks and say, well, okay, here was an example of you resisting ideas or being inflexible. What was the impact of that? So it's sort of part of performance management, but part of the ongoing sort of performance dialogue as well. And there is probably a bit of an acceptance that at some point, all of us display some behaviours which do go against the values a little bit.
Sorry, I dropped off for a moment. So I was asking a question about ROI in terms of how do you demonstrate ROI to the skeptical chief exec? Is there a particular approach that you tend to take?
Well, I think if we go back to one of the things at the beginning, I mean, there is actually research out there that says if people believe in your values, there is a correlation with the performance as well. But it's about looking at some of the metrics that you can see as an organisation. You know, as an organisation. I mean, one potential one out there is your turnover. What happens to your turnover when you're really living the values that people believe in? and where they get that. So there are some things that you can actually bring. It's one of the, it's quite difficult, but if you can actually make some measurements before you've really rolled out the values and then make the measurements afterwards, then you can start to do that. But things like turnover and like performance, where you've got research which is done externally, are actually quite helpful for selling the story into organizations.
And also,
I think too. Sorry, Gary.
go on, Sam.
I was going to say, belonging. So the sort of whole concept of belonging is a really key driver of attrition in organisations as well. So something we did a lot at Calibra is look at predicted attrition rates based on survey questions around loyalty and belonging questions. And one of the key belonging questions in that section is the values or values that here resonate with me personally. So you can start to see if those values resonate, if people feel the values in action, does that drive the sense of belonging and loyalty, and what does that mean for predicted attrition, which ties back to what Julie was saying about turnover as well. You can also start to see from an employer brand perspective what people are saying about you on LinkedIn and Glassdoor, and as well something quite ROI that has a big impact on brand perception, certainly.
Thank you. And we have a question online here, which is about how do you ensure values reflect different generations in the workplace? And I guess we've all heard that younger generations tend to be more focused on seeing the values articulated and expressed in organisations in terms of choosing a future employer. Is that true? Is that something that you've witnessed?
I've witnessed more. I mean, people do now look at the values, but also the purpose. I think one of the bigger driver is the purpose of the organization for the younger generations. A bit of a generalization, but that's probably a stronger drive. Secondly, then they do go to the values, but it may manifest itself in more transactional terms, which nowadays is not so much the younger generation, but post-pandemic and the move to hybrid working. As you know, all generations, and in particular older generational middle class senior managers have got themselves quite comfortable, for example, of remaining at home because they can afford it and it's quite comfortable. Whereas living the values of engagement, for example, if that was one of your values, and inclusiveness means you need to be in the office or connecting with people more. So I think it's not necessarily a young generation versus an old generation.
Okay, cool, very good. So we are heading up to 5 o'clock now, so we'll probably just need to pause it there. And if I can thank all of our speakers today, so Gary, Julie, Sam, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting session, and you've answered a lot of the questions. We'll try to collate the questions when we distribute slides, and the recording will be available within the next day or two as well, so you'll be able to pick up the recording. So just before we finish, I wanted to mention we've got 2 more live events actually before the end of the year. We have an event on Wednesday the 23rd of November on the subject of Connect, Engage and Grow, Building the Human-Centric Workplace, sponsored by Onboarder and hosted by our good friends at King's College London. If you know their iconic building on Bush House on the Strand, very nice venue. Details are there on our website for you to have a look at. And I can also announce that we've got a Christmas special taking place on Wednesday the 7th of December. That's going to be at another iconic building, which is number 70 The Strand, which is, those of you might remember, Shelmex House, which is now the headquarters of the Pearson Group. And we'll be enjoying, amongst other things, mulled wine and mince pies on that evening. So that's not yet up on the website, but will be up very shortly. So lots to look forward to before Christmas. All remains for me to say, hope you enjoyed it. Always happy to hear your feedback and suggestions. Have a very good evening, and bye from all the speakers.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.